So we'll now move on to our second panel, and I know there were a lot of questions, which we hope some of those will be discussed throughout the day today. But given the time, we have to move on. So we'll move to our second panel. So if the panelists in the challenges and risks of diverse carbon accounting methods could kindly turn on their videos. And I will, without further ado, turn the floor to our moderator of this session, Michael Berger, who is the Executive Director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law and a Senior Research Scholar at Columbia Law School. So Mike, do we have you?
I think we do.
Okay, great. Good morning. Yeah. Okay, so I'll turn the floor to you now. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon or good evening from wherever you may be joining us. So as Perrine laid out, we live in an era of corporate climate ambition. From the We Are Still In coalition that formed after the election of Donald Trump in the United States, to the most recent net zero commitments and pledges, many of the world's largest public companies are vocalizing their support for and commitment to science-based targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But as we also just heard from Perrine, we live in an era of well-founded skepticism about those very same commitments. Concerns about corporate greenwashing, the lack of external regulation and internal governance controls, and the depth of the corporate commitments are all prevalent. One question that frequently recurs is how to actually go about accounting for those corporate emissions in a way that ensures that the reductions achieved are real. That's what this panel is going to talk about. And we're going to explore the issue of carbon accounting. We have an outstanding panel of leading experts from around the world to guide us through some of the intricacies and ultimately the implications of carbon accounting practices for the private sector. So the way this panel will proceed is we will have a series of 4 presentations from each of our panelists. I will provide an introduction to each one of them before they speak, rather than all up front at the beginning. There will be a good amount of time at the end of this for a question and answer period. So I invite and encourage our participants to file those questions into the Q&A section of the Zoom, and we will, go through them and dig out questions for the panelists to spur conversation afterwards. So we're going to start with Suzanne Green. Suzanne is the Global Procurement, Sustainability, and Advocacy Leader at Dow, dedicated to achieving sustainability using procurement as a lever. Prior to joining Dow earlier this year, she co-founded the Sustainable Supply Chains Lab at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Center for Transportation and Logistics. She serves as an advisor for the Science Based Targets Initiative, Smart Freight Center, and Coalition on Materials Emission Transparency, and has authored numerous publications on carbon accounting, climate target setting, and the role of carbon offsets and insets for supply chain decarbonization. So Suzanne, I'll turn it on over to you. We are having an issue hearing you if you have started speaking.
How about now?
Now we're good.
Okay, good. Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Michael. It's really great to be here. I'm happy to be on this panel and to talk about this important topic. And I think Perrine gave a great introduction to what we're going to talk about with carbon accounting. And do I share screen or will you share my slides?
I believe you are set up to share them.
Okay, perfect. Let me go ahead and get that started. Okay, everybody see that okay? Nice scene here. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this, my remarks here is just talk a little bit about what is carbon accounting, what does it mean, how does it work? So I'm really gonna go through the basics here. And why am I qualified to do such a thing? Michael touched on that. I've been writing these carbon accounting guidelines for, well, about 10 years now. So I've been kind of in the beginning of when we first started thinking about CO2 as a metric, something we can count, to nowadays that has become the sustainability thing that we count, right? So we've really evolved over the last decade. But as Perrine pointed to, there are still, a lot of things we can solve. And what I want to point out is what's going on in this world of carbon accounting, and what are some initiatives that might be helping us solve some of the challenges that we face. So you can check out my publications. My website is there. Martin's going to talk about the comet, so you'll hear more about that as well. So when we talk about carbon accounting, it sounds a little bit boring, but it's kind of the basis to everything that we're doing with our global climate goals, right? So we need the numbers to be able to set targets, to make goals, to track our progress towards our goals. And there are some different ways we do it, right? We can measure by satellite, but what mostly we do is we estimate carbon emissions. So we use estimations to understand where our emissions are. And there are different mechanisms for companies versus countries. So with companies, we have Science-Based Targets Initiative that is driving climate goal setting. And through countries, we have the Paris Accords and the mechanisms there. And that's all trying to get us to keeping global temperatures under 2 degrees, right? So the numbers really matter here. And I want to break down carbon accounting into 2 different buckets. So one is corporate carbon footprints and the other is product carbon footprints. So they're the same but different, right? So they're 2 different things that kind of overlap. And corporate carbon footprints is what you maybe hear about the most in this world of carbon accounting. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol was the kind of grandfather of all of this. It came out in 2004. If you want to learn more about carbon accounting, this is where you start. This is what you read first, right? And they have all the instructions for how to calculate. And Perrine mentioned scope 1, 2, and 3 accounting. It's really important here. And actually, this is a little bit of a overlap from what Perrine showed, but this figure shows the breakdown between scope 1 and 2, that's in green, and scope 3 emissions, which is in gray, for different industries. And you can see how important scope 3 emissions are when you talk about carbon accounting. So that's the supply chain. So I'm at Dow, I'm in the chemical industry, and our scope 3 emissions really line up here. 2/3 of our emissions each year are in our supply chain. So it's hugely important that we can account for these emissions and report them transparently so we can reduce. And when we think about the supply chain, we're talking about, who are we buying from? Dow has 30,000 suppliers. So we buy from a lot of different companies, and we need to get numbers from all of these companies to really get an accurate accounting of our emissions. So you can imagine that can get quite complicated with a large company like Dow. And there are a lot of initiatives that are out there to try to improve our ability to share this data within the supply chain. I'm going to highlight one that I have been involved with, the Global Logistics Emissions Council Framework. And this is a carbon accounting guidance that's part of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So it's kind of in the family of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and it's related to freight transportation. And this was the first method to bring together carbon accounting for all the different modes of freight. So planes, trains, ships, trucks. Prior to this framework coming out, each mode of transportation was calculating differently, or different regions were calculating differently, and it was really quite complicated. So a lot of work has gone into figuring out what's the one way we can all agree that we calculate our emissions for transportation. So we have to look at scope 1, 2, and 3. We have to look at the different greenhouse gases. And we have to look at things like the fuel life cycle. And I'm going to show you why that one was a particularly important one for transportation. So let me show you what that looks like. So this figure shows you the kilograms of CO2 per liter of fuel. So we're talking about transportation fuel, so diesel or gas that you put in your car or your truck, but there's lots of different fuels that are out there for transportation. And the orange is the production and distribution of fuel. So that's the upstream supply chain of the fuel. And the yellow is when you burn the fuel. So that's what we're often thinking about, right? The combustion of the fuel. But what we see is there are emissions that happen before we burn it. And when you think about something like biodiesel, right, at the top there, all of the emissions are in the production stage, and there really are zero emissions at combustion. And this was a really, really important thing with the GLEC framework that we had to solve, that we had to convince basically all of the stakeholders that you must account for those orange emissions, those upstream emissions, or you're not catching everything. So this is the type of thing, this inconsistencies you get within carbon accounting that can make a huge difference in your final number. So you can check that out. The GLEC framework is all online. Now I'm going to move to product carbon footprints. So that's what I think is kind of the cool thing of the moment, is knowing, what is the carbon footprint of the thing you bought? What did we buy? What is that carbon emission? So I'm showing you 3 different numbers. These are studies that I have done, and sorry, I didn't link them there, but these are numbers that we calculated for carbon footprint of a banana. A pair of shoes. I just showed you 1 shoe, but it's actually 2 shoes, 2 tennis shoes, and a laptop. So you can see what is the carbon footprint of those items. And I think a lot of people don't really know the number associated with the items that we buy every day. And you don't have a label. It's not so common to see a label on your banana that shows 118 grams of CO2, but yeah, it's important. And it's important when you total it up too, right? When you think about how many bananas are produced in a year, that 118 grams turns into, almost 12 million tons of CO2. So that's another way to think about product carbon emissions, is how much is produced each year? How much does your company produce each year? So that's another kind of way we can look at the data and decide what's a good choice for us, right? Is a sneaker good or bad? Is a banana good or bad? We need these numbers to help us understand that. And I want to highlight an initiative that's going on right now related to product carbon footprints through the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And they founded this Pathfinder project, Carbon Transparency Pathfinder, and it's all about product carbon footprints and helping us unlock this ability to share the data along the supply chain, to know, what are we buying? What's the carbon footprint? How can we compare one product against another and connect all these players on the supply chain? So there's a new framework on the left-hand side that's a methodology, another one of these methods that we really need to get our numbers right. And you can check this out. I really feel optimistic about this, and Dow's quite involved in this initiative, where we sit a little bit in the middle of the supply chain, right? Connecting the raw materials producers to the end consumer. So we see ourselves as a key stakeholder of data and information. And I think Martin probably will touch on a little bit about how these types of things work in more detail. So that's what I had. I hope this is helpful, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, Suzanne. Thank you so much for that introduction to some of the intricacies of carbon accounting, and I know that we will hear a bit more on that from Martin. So we will next hear from Martin Dietrich Brock, who conducts economic and legal research, training, and advisory work at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. He focuses on mining and energy investments for sustainable development and climate action, and coordinates the center's cross-cutting work on climate investment policy. And today we'll be hearing a good deal about his work with COMET and on carbon accounting. So Martin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you, Jack, for passing the slides. So Suzanne is a wonderful act to follow. I'm really glad she's given you, the introduction to carbon accounting from a technical perspective. Now, for a company to align with the Paris Agreement 1.5 degree goal, it needs to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by half by 2030 and to 0 by 2050. And a company that sets out to achieve this needs to know how much it emits, identify the most cost-effective measures to reduce emissions, and then implement them, track progress over time, and adjust course as needed. Emissions accounting and disclosure permeate all these steps. Companies need accurate, complete, and comparable emissions data to plan and act, and to inform their regulators, investors, customers, and the public. Next slide, please. Now the reality check. Earlier this month, the business strategy firm Boston Consulting Group published a study on company-level emissions accounting and disclosure. The survey covered almost 1,300 companies around the globe from various industries and of various sizes. 85% of the companies surveyed are concerned about reducing emissions, but 81% don't accurately report their own Scope 1 emissions. 2/3 don't report any value chain emissions from their suppliers or customers, even though those emissions account for about 90% of the average company's total. 76% of the respondents say they're unable to measure the full carbon footprint of their products and services, including product usage and end-of-life impact. 87% indicate that they want to report emissions better, but need better tools to do so. Overall, they acknowledge a 30 to 40% average error rate in their emissions measurements. And unsurprisingly, only 11% met their emissions reductions targets in the past 5 years. Sylvain Duranton, one of the report's authors, said in an interview, if companies are not collecting and analyzing granular data and emission factors, they can't expect their measurements to be accurate. Now, how does a company determine the level of granularity of the data it should be collecting and analyzing, or what emission factors it should be using to get the desired and necessary accuracy? Next slide, please. So there's an increasing number of frameworks, standards, methodologies, and tools for emissions accounting and disclosure. These include the GCG Protocol that Suzanne has already mentioned, CDP, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI. There are also various sector-specific carbon accounting initiatives. They're not connected throughout the value chain, and none of them spans the entire value chain. Each uses its own accounting and attribution principles and provides its own guidance on data collection, which may or may not be aligned with what the others are recommending. Since they're all voluntary, companies are left to independently choose from them. And since they don't provide specific guidance on data collection, which since they don't provide specific guidance on data collection and requirements needed for this accurate reporting, companies are left to figure out independently how to use them. So companies are not required to disclose how they estimate their emissions, if they measured the data themselves, if they spoke to other companies in their supply chain, and what type of research they did to prepare for these disclosures. Next slide, please. The GCG Protocol offers a widely accepted overarching framework. It distinguishes between a company's direct emissions from its own facilities and vehicles, which we've seen as Scope 1. Then Scope 2, which is emissions from purchased electricity. And Scope 3, which is the total emissions along the value chain, upstream and downstream, from manufacture and transportation of its products to their eventual use, disposal, or recycling. CDP is a widely used emissions disclosure platform. It accepts over 60 emissions accounting methodologies. In 2016, 92% of Fortune 500 companies reporting to CDP used the GCG Protocol to measure emissions, directly or indirectly, because many of these frameworks are built on the GCG Protocol. So when we say we need a harmonized accounting method, we often get the response, oh, but there already is the GCG Protocol. has somehow become synonymous with robust accounting. But a closer look reveals that the GCG protocol is too general a framework. It standardizes the areas that companies should focus on, but doesn't really determine how these areas should be measured, estimated, or disclosed. It only provides high-level accounting guidance, allowing ample room for interpretation, which then leads to inconsistent reporting. Even if the disclosures are made based on the same reporting framework, they're not comparable across companies and value chains. And the problem is especially acute for Scope 3. Without universal rules for attributing or validating emissions from materials to products, accountability of emissions along value chains is difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. Next slide, please, just to go back to our network of frameworks. So the bottom line is that there's no mandatory, harmonized, universally accepted methodology for a company to measure the emissions from its own activities, or the emissions embedded in the raw materials that it purchases, or the carbon footprint of the products that it sells. So what can reasonably come out of a voluntary, unregulated, and fragmented emissions accounting and reporting regime? At best, emissions data that are not comparable across companies, value chains, or countries. Data that are barely useful for companies to track emissions, plan their reduction, and monitor progress. Data that will not be useful for companies that are trying to choose low carbon products and services. In this context, the results of the Boston Consulting Group survey that I showed are entirely unsurprising. Besides the lack of harmonization, accounting for emissions from mineral and industrial supply chains has an additional layer of complexity. Production processes and transportation in those value chains, including steel, copper, cement, respond for 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Depending on the type of material or industrial process, there can be wide disparity in terms of volumes produced, energy intensity, and the volume of emissions from energy and non-energy processes. In addition, most modern industries involve multiple companies that operate internationally, making it increasingly difficult to keep track of different materials and products and the companies responsible for the associated emissions. Next slide, please, for an illustration of the complexity of accounting involving multinational operations. So this shows the carbon footprint of cradle-to-gate copper production. Across various academic studies, the carbon intensity here ranged from 1.1 to 8.5 kilograms of carbon equivalent per ton of copper, per kilogram of copper, a factor of almost 8 from the 1.1 to 8.5. So depending on where the production happens and on what metallurgical process is used, the carbon footprint of copper can vary significantly. So if you're estimating carbon emissions by choosing one single emission factor and multiplying it by the activity data, meaning the amount of copper produced, you would generate emission estimates that are, at best, very rough approximations and most likely are very far from reality. Next slide, please. So to harmonize this multitude of emissions accounting methods and to provide sector-specific guidance for companies in material and industrial supply chains, a new initiative was launched in early 2020, the Coalition on Materials Emissions Transparency, or COMET. It's an initiative between us here at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, CCSI, the Payne Institute for Public Policy at the Colorado School of Mines, and RMI. In June this year, the Secretariat of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC or UN Climate Change, partnered with COMET to support our mission. COMET's goal is to develop a harmonized, universally accepted, and verifiable greenhouse gas accounting framework, as well as sector-specific guidance for the application of this framework throughout mineral and industrial supply chains. To do so, COMET will collaborate with mineral producers, industry, investors, end users, academia, and other stakeholders who are interested in carbon accounting. Now, COMET will not add to the existing fragmentation. Instead, the COMET framework will bring together the main emission standards and protocols, both generic and sector-specific, into an integrated set of guidance documents, which will be built on the principles of the GCG Protocol and therefore will be compatible with the GCG Protocol. COMET will leverage, harmonize, and integrate existing methods, not duplicate or replace them. The double goal here is to accurately measure emissions across material and industrial supply chains and make the disclosures comparable and reliable. More specifically, the framework will create translation tables, so to speak, between the myriad methodologies. Disclosures based on COMET will be universally comparable. Next slide, please. So just a quick snapshot of our work plan over the next 4 years. We will create a comprehensive set of guidance documents representing the state-of-the-art in emissions accounting and attribution. The framework will cover direct and indirect emissions, meaning scopes 1, 2, and 3, considering the full life cycle of a material, no matter where it was produced. To develop sector-specific guidance for metals and minerals, COMET will follow the template of successful initiatives for other sectors, notably freight transportation, which is for which there is the Global Logistics Emission Council GLEC framework, which Suzanne on our panel developed and has talked about, and also the framework for information and communication technology products, the ICT sector guidance. We'll also develop a web-based tool to make the framework applicable by all users, especially companies, a global utility to show country-level emissions data reported using the COMET framework, and also create a coalition of stakeholders to adopt and promote the framework. Next slide, please, is just a thank you slide, but there's a final word from me on mandatory emissions from accounting and mandatory emissions accounting and disclosure. So when partnering with COMET, UN Climate Change Deputy Executive Secretary Ovais Sarmad highlighted the importance of streamlining reporting and providing methods to, quote, reliably and comparably estimate industrial sector emissions. A harmonized accounting framework with sector-specific guidance for companies to generate reliable and comparable emissions is, of course, only the first step. The next step is to guarantee the uptake of this framework. And the uptake, in our view, should be driven by national and international legal and regulatory frameworks. The existing voluntary and fragmented disclosure regime needs to give way to a robust and mandatory system for disclosures that are accurate, accessibly transparent, comparable, and actionable. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Martin. Next, we will hear from Barbara Davidson. Barbara is a senior analyst for Carbon Tracker's regulatory team and the lead author of the recent Flying Blind report, which analyzed companies accounting for climate-related risks. She has over 20 years of advisory, accounting, relationship, and stakeholder management experience, and she formerly headed the investor engagement team at the International Accounting Standards Board, where she founded and implemented their investors in financial reporting program and secured many significant relationships in the global investment community. Here to tell us a bit more about the work she and Carbon Tracker are up to is Barbara Davidson. Barbara.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you again for inviting me to speak and everyone for their presentations so far. I don't know, Jack, would you like me to share, I suppose, or will you be sharing? I guess that means I'm sharing.
If you can do it, just go right ahead and do it, Barbara.
Hopefully I can do it. There's always a complication that comes up, like my computer freezes. Can people see that?
There we go.
Everyone see my slides?
Yes,
okay,
now
great.
We're good to go.
Fabulous. Okay, so I'm going to speak a little bit about something slightly different than the other speakers to date. based on my background in the work that we're doing at Carbon Tracker. I want to speak, as Michael mentioned, more about the work we recently did in analyzing the financial effects of climate matters and whether they were considered in financial statements. So I'll talk a little bit about the work that we did in analyzing this, and I'm trying to also give a perspective more of a user of the emissions information. So hopefully this will help show how the need for more consistent, comparable, reliable data is obviously out there. And also to explain how, so not to confuse accounting for financial accounting and accounting for carbon, but the accounting for carbon is important for the financial statements accounting, because the greater amount of obviously emissions that we see in a company's reporting, the greater financial effect we think we'll see on the company's financial statement from the energy transition. And so this is important for investors to understand the effects of the energy transition on the company's financial statements. And so there is a link between the accounting for these two items. Investors also want to understand, especially as we talked about already, scope 3 emissions. They need to understand the extent to which a company's products will be sellable or unsellable in the future. They need to understand if decarbonizing operations is, when a company talks about decarbonization, is that more about greenwashing, depending on if they're only decarbonizing scope 1 and 2, but the vast majority of their emissions are scope 3. And they want to understand the impacts on the company's supply chain, as was already mentioned, and the robustness of a company's climate strategy. So I'll talk a little bit about what we looked at in financial statements and then how this might, or the emissions links through to the financial statements. A quick overview. Oh, I'm switching the wrong slides. Okay, there we go. A quick overview of the report that Michael mentioned that we recently published in September, called Flying Blind: The Glaring Absence of Climate Risks in Financial Reporting. Again, we looked at financial statements and audit reports for 107 companies that operate in the energy, industrials, and transportation industries, primarily in the EU, UK, the US, and Canada. We looked at the companies to determine, again, the extent to which there was evidence of consideration of climate-related matters in their financial statements, and also whether auditors looked at this when they were performing their audits of these companies. So we wanted to see the extent to which policies and regulations related to the energy transition and company targets, when they had targets, were reflected in the company financial statements. This work was off the back of clarifications by financial accounting and audit standard setters that said that material climate-related risks were required to be considered in company financial statements and in audits today. There are also investors representing over 100 trillion in assets under management that have written letters. Different groups of investors have sent out letters in 2020 saying they expect to see this climate-related, the effects of climate risks and targets in company financial statements in 2020, and they expected the auditors to address these issues. And the other point that I wanted to make was that the companies we looked at were mostly Climate Action 100 plus companies. And so these companies were already a target for investors for either their role in the energy transition or the extent of their emissions. These companies are said to represent 80% of global industrial greenhouse gas emissions. So there was already an underlying assumption that these companies would not only have significant emissions, but that we should see something in the financial statements about the effects of the energy transition. So the next slide talks about, our key findings, which were poor. As we've seen so far, and I think in the results in the previous panel, there were poor findings when they were looking at climate targets and disclosures along emissions. I mean, these, with respect to climate targets and offsetting and consideration of climate in financial statements, very poor results. And this is, again, considering the population of companies that we looked at were expected to have significant impacts from climate, significant emissions, and that accounting and auditing already required consideration of these issues in the financial statements. So the first bar talks about whether we saw any discussion about indication of climate risks or targets, the financial effects, again, in the financial statements. And over 70% of the 107 companies showed no indication that they considered any effects of the energy transition in their financial statements. And so investors had no way of really knowing whether the assets and liabilities that they were looking at reflected the effects of the energy transition. The next bar talks about the extent to which companies disclosed the assumptions and estimates that they use that could be affected by climate when they prepare their financial statements. So, and only 25% of companies that we looked at disclosed any of the climate-related assumptions or estimates that they use. So this relates to commodity prices and useful lives, for example, that could be used when estimating impairment of assets, the timeframes over which companies may have to meet their decommissioning obligations, or effects of changes in production or demand estimates from the energy transition. And a lot of these changes are already happening today, and we expected to see the financial effects on assets and liabilities today, and on the assumptions that companies used when they're preparing their financial statements. So we look to see how global emissions policies, changing regulations, changes to demand affected, again, things like commodity prices that were used or asset lives. But only 25% of companies even provided disclosure of the information they used to prepare their financial statements. And so we couldn't even tell, again, if there were the effects of the energy transition were even in the financial statements. The third bar starts to bring together also emissions reduction targets and other things, and how we look to see if companies were telling a consistent climate story across their reporting. So here, we look to see if companies talked about the energy transition as a risk, or if they had emission reduction targets. Did they talk about the effects on their financial statements? How would this affect the assets they have today and the liabilities they have today? And often, as you can see, over 70% of this companies told an inconsistent story, where they talked a lot in the front half or other reports about the energy transition and their emissions, but there was little evidence as to how those flowed through their financial statements. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in my next slide. The only other thing I wanted to mention too is that 80% of the auditors and the audit reports of these companies did not provide evidence of consideration of the energy transition, the financial effects of that, when they audited the financial statements. And this is even when they were auditing items in financials, such as impairments of assets that relied on long-term cash flows that would be affected by the energy transition, when those companies were estimated in long-term cash flows. But the auditors did not talk about whether they considered the financial effects of the energy transition when they were auditing these items. So these are all important to show you the effects of companies with large emissions and how they should be flowing back through the financial statements for investors. So the next slide, and this slide, I wanted to bring together how the emissions that we found for some companies and some of their emissions targets flowed through or didn't flow through into their financials when we reviewed them. So this provides an example of the information that we obtained for 2 European companies, Shell and BP. And actually, these are some of the better examples, if you will, in terms of transparency of disclosure that we found in our reviews. And they're both integrated oil and gas companies, but they have different descriptions of their emissions, especially their scope 3 emissions, and how they're determined or their boundaries. And these emissions, as were already discussed, are the most significant emissions for these companies. So you can see for Shell, their scope 3 emissions are approximately 95% of their total emissions. I mean, that's huge. And that's really important then for it to be clear how these emissions are calculated, gathered, and it needs to be consistent with other oil and gas companies in order to understand how the energy transition will affect these companies, and also how these companies should be addressing their emissions targets, because clearly this relates to products sold. So Shell was clear. It talks about the scope of their scope of their scope 3 are the end use of their products, which is the products they produce, as well as the life cycle emissions of the energy products that are produced by other companies, but then Shell sells. But then it also identifies the boundaries that it sets using what it calls a net carbon footprint, which it also uses to measure its emissions intensity, and it also uses it for consideration of carbon capture and storage. And this is where it got a little bit confusing, at least when we were looking at the description of the scope 3, as to how this fits in with, say, the GCG Protocol category 11, where we understood that Shell was using operational control to determine its emissions, but we still weren't sure what this meant with this net carbon footprint. Did this add or take away from anything that was in the other requirements today, or the other ways that one could determine emissions? Shell also has net zero targets for 2050, and it claims that its targets cover all of the energy it sells, which is good. That means it's saying it covers all of its emissions. If we look at BP, their scope 3 emissions are based on equity share. That's fine. Their emissions are about 88% scope 3 of total emissions. Again, very big. But then they say that they've excluded a significant subsidiary, equity subsidiary, even though they're doing equity share basis, their equity subsidiary Rosneft, which is a big subsidiary. They have significant influence over them, but we don't know the reason that they've excluded Rosneft's emissions, or the extent to which this would affect their total emissions. How much does this exclude from their total emissions then? The other thing that they say is that they base their scope 3 on upstream oil and gas production volumes, which is also a little bit confusing. So does that mean that there are other products sold that are the emissions, those emissions are not considered when they're reporting their scope 3 emissions? For example, how about downstream purchases from other entities? How are those accounted for? So there is a little bit of confusion in the descriptions between the two companies and their scope 3 emissions. They both provided the emissions information in similar locations, their sustainability reports and annual reports, and they both obtained limited assurance over that information. So that for us was was a good way of finding the information and getting some comfort over it. But then when we looked at the financial statements, we tried to understand how those emissions were considered in the financials. So Shell talks about potential costs associated with its greenhouse gas emissions, such as the price of carbon, and that it considers that in its financials, but it doesn't quantify this. It doesn't give a carbon price that it considers in its financials. It may talk about carbon prices elsewhere, but we don't know the extent to which they're the same as what are used in the financials, and how did the reduction of their emissions affect them financially. They do talk about, they actually are very clear that their net zero targets are not yet considered in their operational planning and assumptions that they use in their financial statements. Okay. And they say that their targets are also conditioned on society at large changing. So we know that their financials do not reflect their targets. We're not sure how their targets might change their financial statements. It's not clear how they're going to continue to extract and sell fossil fuels, how that would affect or reduce how they would achieve their emissions targets with those continued operations. But they did disclose the quantitative assumptions, oil and gas prices that they use. So there are some ways of making some informed decisions and adjustments to their financials. By contrast, BP has somewhat of a better reflection of the energy transition in their financials. They indicated they lowered commodity prices as a result of the energy transition. They expect their oil and gas reserves for their upstream assets to be used in the next 10 years. So that's helpful for the reader. They also talk about costs of carbon, and that they consider this in their financials, but we don't know the prices that they use. So again, it's hard to estimate the effects on their financial statements. They have net zero ambitions, not targets. And it's unclear if those ambitions are considered at all. So reductions of their scope 3 emissions in the timing of the useful lives of assets, so that if they're going to continue to use assets for a certain amount of time, how will they reduce emissions? There are other things like timing of their decommissioning obligations. How does this fit in? How they're going to increase production for another 10 years. How does this fit in with some of their interim targets? So there's still a bit of a disconnect between the emissions, and then how are those emissions going to affect, and the targets affecting their financial statements. Also, I wanted to note that neither company talks about the extent of costs involved or feasibility of the offsetting technologies that they plan to use to achieve their net zero targets or ambitions. They don't talk about that in the financial statements at all. And then going and just giving another example of emissions versus company reporting, some of the oil and gas majors we looked at, such as Chevron, gave some emissions intensity reduction targets, not absolute targets, but intensity reduction, but they gave no scope 3 net zero targets. And so even though they stated they looked at their scope 1 and 2 emissions profiles, and intensity and reduction opportunities in their investment decisions, without talking about scope 3, which is their largest source of emissions as an oil and gas company, any climate strategy that they had would not appropriately address or reduce emissions. So it's interesting to see how this flows through to the financial statements. And the one last thing I wanted to note was what does this mean again? What are the potential impacts on the financial statements when we don't have the information flowing through? So again, even if the company has not set emissions reduction targets, the extent of emissions information still provides investors with an indication of how the company might be affected by the energy transition. And so they could have overstated assets if they're not showing consideration of the energy transition in their financials. Their productive assets, which cause emissions on their own directly and indirectly through the products they produce, could be overvalued. They could have asset lives that are longer than they could actually use the assets because of policies and regulations needed to reduce emissions. So their liabilities could be undervalued because they could be underestimating costs, or the time frame may be accelerated because they need to reduce emissions again. This could all lead to overstated profits. Dividend streams may no longer be reliable. Investments may then continue to be in the wrong types of activities or assets for both the companies and the investors, and this could mean significant loss of investor capital. And so if we don't have the accurate emissions information that we can go and link back to the financial statements and climate strategies with which we can then challenge companies that aren't disclosing how they're going to address these issues, it's very difficult to allocate capital to the companies and activities in the time needed to meet the Paris Agreement goals. And that's my presentation, and there's my email address if anyone wanted to ask me any other questions. Thank you for this, and I will try to stop sharing if I can find the button, which I cannot find it. That's
Jack,
funny.
maybe you can jump in.
Jack, can you stop me from sharing, please?
Barbara, thank you so much.
There it is. I found it.
You found it? Great. Thank you so much for your presentation. So we've heard about some of the methodologies involved in carbon accounting, and then with Barbara's presentation about one of the ways in which carbon accounting can factor into financial reporting and issues around climate risk. Sort of one area that, of course, drives climate risk is litigation risk. And we'll now hear from Samuel Coles, who's going to, I think, talk about a case that sort of bridges both of these areas of methodologies for carbon accounting and the implications of those carbon accounting methodologies for litigation risk in relationship to climate change. Samuel is an attorney who started his career as a member of Roger Cox's legal team in the case Milieu Defensie et al. Versus Royal Dutch Shell, which some of you may have heard of. This is a case where there was a recent decision from a Dutch trial court or lower court that, as Samuel will describe, orders Shell to reduce its Scope 3 emissions, among other implications. This is a big deal case in the climate litigation world that, without question, we will see more of its ilk soon coming up in courts around the world. That would be my best guess. And to help explain exactly why that is, I'll turn it over to Samuel.
Thank you, Michael. And also thank you to the other panelists for the previous presentations. And indeed, I might fall a little bit out of line and provide some legal insights on this matter. I will share my screen. Let's see if this will work. Yeah. And then I hope this works. First of all, a brief word about myself and our legal team. Indeed, my name is Samuel Coles. I'm a lawyer at Paulussen Advocaat, and for the past 2.5 years, I have been working on the Shell case on the team of, indeed, Roger Cox. And he did not only make history with the Shell case this year, but also won the groundbreaking Urgenda case in 2015, which was the first time a state was ordered to speed up its emission reduction. In addition, our team also assisted the Belgian law firm Equal Partners in the Urgenda-inspired Belgian climate case, which also led to a victory in June of this year. So the title of this event is called Corporate Alignment to the Paris Agreement, from Ambition to Action. Then maybe it's best to start by answering the question, what does recent climate litigation teach us about the value of the Paris Agreement? And you might not expect this from a lawyer, but the strict legal status is not that relevant. A company like, for example, Royal Dutch Shell is obviously no party to the Paris Agreement, but that does not matter, because it really is about a simple but alarming fact that can be distilled from the Paris Agreement, namely that there is a universal and political consensus based on the best available science that we should limit global warming, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this means that in every court case, this particular fact can be used as a starting point, namely that there is a universally defined danger line that should not be crossed if we want to avert an existential crisis. And this is an important takeaway for climate litigation worldwide. And although the three cases I just mentioned and we worked on all have important differences, at its very core, their principles are quite similar. That is that the defendants, whether they are public or private entities, are all systemic players who have many similar traits, to name a few. As systemic entities, they all have control over a substantial amount of greenhouse gases, at least an amount that is substantial enough to have legal significance. And I will return to this point later on, and as this is where carbon accounting comes into play. And also these defendants have known about the dangers of climate change for many decades already, and they all know that the radical phase out of fossil fuels is necessary as much as a phase in of energy efficiency and renewables. As systemic players, they are also in a position to use their power and control in a way that matters to achieve the universal goal of preventing dangerous climate change. And last, these defendants also have no Paris-aligned climate policies in place and do not take up their proportional share of the burden to achieve the Paris target. So taking into account the universal danger line that is defined in the Paris Agreement, as well as the traits of these public and private defendants, and of course also taking into account all other relevant facts and circumstances that we brought forward, the courts in these cases, in these three cases, have all come to the same conclusion, and that is that the impact of dangerous climate change on human life and human health will be so drastic that the defendants violate human rights if their climate policies are not Paris aligned. So with this in mind, let me zoom in on the Shell case in light of today's panel's theme. First, a short overview of the case. The case is a civil law case against Royal Dutch Shell, which is the parent company of the Shell Group, which comprises of approximately 1,100 companies worldwide. RDS, Royal Dutch Shell, is the entity that determines the climate policy of the entire Shell Group and therefore also controls whether or not the group will reduce its emissions. In the judgment, the court found that there was an imminent breach of RDS's civil duty of care. This is a so-called open norm in which all relevant facts and circumstances can be weighed. In essence, the imminent breach follows from the fact that RDS's climate policy is not aligned with what is needed according to the Paris Agreement. And what is needed are absolute emission reductions also in the short term. Shell has an ambition to reach net zero by 2050, but has no specific plan to work towards that ambition. And the demand in this case was that Shell would reduce its emissions by 45% in 2030, in line with the global average emission reduction pathway. So short-term absolute emission reductions are of essential importance because of the cumulative effect of emissions. The latest IPCC findings indicate that the remaining carbon budget that gives us a fighting chance to limit the average temperature increase to 1.5 degrees will be spent before 2030 at the current rate of emissions. Basically, which emissions we do or we do not reduce between now and 2030 will for the most part decide our future. And this exact point was also made abundantly clear in the recent German climate case, in which Germany's climate policy was deemed unconstitutional as a result of an imminent breach of freedom rights of future generations because the can of the required reduction effort was kicked down the road for too long. So in essence, the case was about RDS's legal responsibility to do its part to prevent dangerous climate change. But before that could be assessed, and then I come to today's theme, is RDS's impact on the problem had to be determined. And that is indeed where carbon accounting comes into play. RDS reports on the total greenhouse gas emissions of the Shell group, so the 1, 2, and scope 1, 2, and 3. In its annual reports, the sustainability reports, and through the Carbon Disclosure Project. It does so mainly on the basis of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And of course, the exact numbers vary year by year, but the total emissions connected with the Shell group represent approximately 1.2% of all global emissions. And as was already explained by Barbara's presentation, approximately 95% of all total Shell emissions are those related to the products they sold, so scope 3 emissions. Although there was some debate about the exact percentage and ranking of worldwide emissions by the Shell group, the court recognized that either way, the Shell group is a major player on the worldwide market of fossil fuels. The court noted that when all scopes of emissions are included, so 1, 2, and 3, the Shell group is responsible for significant CO2 emissions all over the world, often exceeding emission of states like, for example, the Netherlands. The legal question then that had to be answered was whether or not Shell has a responsibility, a legal responsibility, for the vast majority of their emissions, what we said, the scope 3. And Milieudefensie pointed to various reasons why there should indeed be such responsibility, and in the end, the court agreed. So let me briefly address a few. A first argument is found in the rather simple fact that oil and gas companies have control over scope 3 emissions because every company determines independently and of its own how many fossil fuels it wishes to sell. If a company sells more fossil fuels, the scope 3 emissions rise, and if a company sells fewer fossil fuels, the scope 3 emissions decrease. And this is something Shell did not and could not dispute. In fact, for example, Shell already acknowledged since the 1990s that it has responsibility for the emissions of its customers by stating in their own publications it aims to reduce the emissions of its customers by offering sustainable energy carrying products to its customers. In this respect, the court explicitly ruled that with due observance of existing contractual obligations, RDS is free to decide not to make new investments in explorations and fossil fuels and to change the energy package offered by the Shell group. The court also emphasized that Shell's responsibility for scope 3 emissions is not removed or reduced by the individual responsibility of the business relations, so including end users, for their own CO2 emissions. Another argument was based upon various scientific and soft law publications from which a general consensus could be extracted that emission reduction targets of companies must encompass all business activities, so 1, 2, and 3. This is especially the case where, like Shell, scope 3 emissions form the bulk of total emissions. And according to Milieudefensie, and the court agrees, this general consensus had to be taken into account in the assessment of RDS's duty of care. In this respect, reference was made, among others, to an elaboration of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in relation to climate responsibilities of companies on the basis of the United Nations guiding principles. And this general consensus also makes sense if we look at the economic, political, and legal power and control a rich and Western-based company like RDS has over emissions across its value chain. In fact, it could be said that RDS has greater and more direct control over scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions than, for example, the state of the Netherlands has control over its emissions of their citizens and companies. Then, to conclude some final remarks, and let me relate this, what I just said, to today's panel's theme. And first of all, as probably better emphasized by all the previous presentations, accurate carbon accounting is essential for all stakeholders, so also for the companies itself, because it enables them to set Paris-aligned climate targets. And that is, in the end, also in their own best interest. And in addition, carbon accounting is important for climate litigation, as it provides the required insight into the defendant's impact on the climate problem, which must then also indeed include Scope 3 emissions. So let me close this presentation by stating that we believe that climate litigation plays an important role in speeding up the needed energy transition, and will continue to do so with a growing number of precedents to build upon. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Samuel. So we are now entering into the panel discussion portion of this panel. Suzanne, if I could ask you to join us here on screen, that would be wonderful. Thank you. And let me take this quick moment to remind our participants to please file any questions that you may have for the panelists, either individually or collectively, into the Q&A portion of the Zoom down at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to start this off by actually opening things up to our panelists in the first instance to respond to or pose questions directly to one another. I believe, Barbara, that you have a good question to maybe kick off this portion, and that can be a conversation starter, and we'll see what happens from there.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Michael, and thank you all the panelists for your really interesting presentations. I wanted to ask you how what the best way might be to require adoption of this information and comparable, so that we can create comparable and consistent standards, because there seems to be a variety of, I'm not sure if standard setters is the right word, but there are a lot of things out there right now. And as you've seen with sustainability reporting, it's become a bit of a, they call it an alphabet soup. So I would argue that one standard setter is needed to oversee this, and then they could decide if there should be industry standards. But then how would you see the best way of doing this? If that's a clear question. I can repeat my question if it's not clear.
I think that it's an excellent question, and Martin, this obviously is part of what COMET is up to, and Suzanne, it's part of what you've been working on for years, and one of the issues you raised as well about harmonization. I take Barbara's question to sort of be driving at, if we can achieve harmonization, and some say, how do we actually, make it mandatory, or at least something starting to approach mandatory, and how do we really inculcate a culture around uniform reporting and accounting in this area?
You want to take that, Martin? And I can chime in.
Sure thing. I was just raising my hand here, actually. So that's a very good question, and thank you, Barbara, for asking it. It goes precisely to my last point in my presentation, the importance of actually moving away from the current fragmented voluntary regime of accounting and disclosures towards a regime that's mandatory and standardized. And I think we're starting to see a few initiatives domestically here in the United States. The Securities and Exchange Commission is starting to look at the issue of mandatory disclosures on climate risks, and that will inevitably have to look into how carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions generally are accounted for. In the European Union context, you also see in the context that the EU taxonomy for sustainability, they're also looking into carbon accounting issues. The problem is, of course, harmonization is still far away from the reality. The United States is only starting to look at this. The EU has a standard or has a framework adopted for the sustainability disclosures there, including carbon emissions, but they do, like CDP, like other frameworks, accept a variety of methods that companies may use to account for these emissions. So in my view, in addition to these national, or in the case of the EU, regional initiatives for harmonization, there should be an international umbrella institutional structure to harmonize how countries are doing it, so that not only we can harmonize at a domestic level, having disclosures be comparable across companies, but also across countries.
And I can chime in too. I agree with what Martin said, and I think things will just invariably get more interesting as the world starts to decarbonize, right? As we start to see low carbon products in the marketplace, right? Where there's a differentiation between a product, a higher and lower carbon steel, for example, where we can choose. You know, then that accounting gets even more. We move past what happens a lot nowadays, which is using industry average data, but that's not going to that's not going to cut it in the world of decarbonization, right? If we want to see these gains, we want to see these reductions in emissions, I want to reach my climate goal, and I need to see that from my supplier. And then once you start thinking about that, then you think, how do we get the right number? How do we verify that? How do I know that's correct so I can actually embed it in my own corporate carbon accounting and know I'm meeting my goal? And then that goes straight back to the need for the standards and methods. And I think that's just going to continue to evolve, and more companies will kind of be awakened to the need for consistency and transparency. Thanks for the question, Barbara.
So Samuel, I'd actually like to sort of toss this over to you in a slightly different way, looking at this as from a litigation perspective and reflecting a bit on your experience in the Shell case. We've talked a little bit between us about the question of what is the right standard and what is the right accounting methodology. But it sounds like that was maybe not even so much of an issue in your case. And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about, at least in regards to fossil fuel companies and litigating against fossil fuel companies, which of course is different than other sectors in material respects, whether you think that this is an issue that could have significant implications for litigation along the lines of the cases that you're involved in, or whether relying on various and different corporate approaches to accounting is okay when you're suing fossil fuel companies.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that what I also emphasize in my presentation is, from a legal standpoint, the first question you have to answer is there a substantial amount of emissions? For example, we all as individuals have some CO2 emissions, but it has to be legally relevant in order to get a legal obligation. So I might have a moral obligation, but that doesn't mean I have a legal responsibility, so I can be sued in court. So that's obviously the first and main question. And then, of course, understandably, you can, from a technical standpoint, for example, regarding Shell or any other oil company for that matter, you can then have a discussion about the parameters or the specific guidelines they use to report on their emissions. So in essence, from a legal standpoint, I personally think that it's not that important to put a lot of energy into that possible discussions that are I believe that can be held, as long as you can answer that first question, which is it a substantial amount of emissions? And that also has to do with picking your battles. So you have to spend your energy and time in such big court cases on the right topics.
Great, thank you, Samuel. So one question that has popped up in the Q&A that I think may be useful to address for those who may not be aware of this technical element. This panel is regards carbon accounting, and the question is, does methane come into this at all? And do other GHGs come into this at all? And if so, how? I think the answer to this is a clear yes, but maybe Suzanne, Barbara, or Martin, you could talk a bit about how methane and other non-carbon GHGs factor into the work that you're doing and into the accounting.
I mean, I can give a very high level, non-detailed response. And that is, from when we looked at the emissions, they're all CO2 equivalent. So the company has to put all the different GHG emissions, not just carbon dioxide, into an equivalent format when they're reporting the emissions that they, their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. It's all in carbon dioxide equivalent, CO2 equivalent amounts. So there is a calculation, but I have to admit, don't know the calculation off the top of my head, but then it would include methane, yes.
I agree, Barbara, it should always be included, and that's why you always look for that CO2 equivalent, right, to make sure that all the greenhouse gases are included in the calculation. And that is something that companies can leave out, right? We do see that. So if you see only CO2, you might ask a question like, is everything included here? And that becomes methane's really important when we think about natural gas, right? Natural gas is a transition fuel. Many companies are switching to it, but methane is a huge issue with natural gas. So we want to make sure that that's definitely included. It's a really important greenhouse gas.
Great, thank you both. So I'd like to sort of pose a question. Well, first let me ask, before I turn to my question, whether Samuel, Martin, or Suzanne, whether there are any questions that you have for the other panelists or any other responses based on the presentations or conversation so far.
I had a question for Martin. I know you're working with the UNFCCC, right, to think about corporate accounting where it meets country accounting. Have you worked with them at all on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, or do you have any thoughts on how that could play into the future of carbon accounting?
So with the UNFCCC, we are not yet working on the carbon border adjustment. We are studying various emissions trading mechanisms and also carbon pricing schemes that are starting to look at how carbon accounting will look at the border when you are comparing emissions intensity across countries or emissions. Carbon footprints from products that are, or materials that are imported. So this is certainly a part of our work plan on our docket for further development as these discussions move ahead, especially in the EU that's probably the most advanced actor now studying a carbon border adjustment, and hopefully bringing these issues to the WTO to ensure their compliance with international trade rules.
Great, thank you. So I have a question I'd sort of like to throw out to the panel. So we've heard about a number of the different methodologies and the implications for carbon accounting, for carbon reporting and financial reporting of climate risk. And the way in which some of this factors into at least some forms of climate litigation. One of the questions I often get is, what can I do about climate change? And I get this from people of all ages and all stripes, right? What can I do? Which is really a question about consumer behavior. I often take it that way, at least, and the question of what consumers ought to know and the extent to which consumer information and consumer decisions matter in this space. And one way of understanding carbon accounting, and I think for instance, as you were presenting on product carbon, Suzanne, I was thinking, this would be something that would be like you go to a fast food restaurant and they have the calories listed up on board, or you go to a gas station and sometimes there's some information there, or you go to buy a car and it tells you what its emissions rates are, as well as its mileage. To what extent, but that doesn't seem to me to be what carbon accounting is really about, per se. That is to say, informing everyday consumers about the carbon content of the products or the the carbon and climate implications of their decisions. But maybe that's wrong. And so I guess my question for you is, how much can we look at carbon accounting as a force for driving consumer behavior? Or is it really something that is intended to drive corporate behavior and ultimately to instill corporate or requirements on corporations? I'll throw that out to everyone. Whoever wants to go first, jump right in. No need to raise hands.
Oh, I'll answer from the product. I like the product information that Suzanne put out, the carbon footprint, product carbon footprints. I mean, it looks to me like if there was a way of labeling products that was, we were able to regulate and show the carbon footprint of products, I could see this really driving consumer behavior. So that kind of reporting, I think, would be at the right level for consumers, and it would really, the consumers would appreciate that. I know from an institutional investor standpoint, the emissions are important that are shown at the corporate level. I'm not sure from a retail investor standpoint if they're really being looked at.
I love this question because I think, yes, we can demand this and we should be demanding this and we should educate ourselves. What does it mean? I showed you the banana carbon footprint, but that's just one kind of banana. That was a banana from Ecuador. What about the banana from Colombia? And what's the difference here? And I think we all can be tweeting, Instagramming, whatever. There's a lot of power in what we say as consumers. We can drive this, and companies listen, right? They get real nervous, when people start tweeting these things. And, I think we absolutely should be demanding and educating ourselves on what the numbers mean. And this discussion has gone on for so long. I think 10 years ago, Tesco said, we're going to put a carbon footprint label on everything in our supermarket, and then that kind of died off. And then Walmart said they would do it, then that died off. And there's so much, in discrepancy between the numbers that no one feels confident putting that label on. But we can do it, and companies are doing it. Like Quorn, the vegetarian meat alternative, they are putting it on their packages. I'm here in Switzerland. You can see it at the grocery store on some of the packages, and I think it's coming, but we need to demand it and we need to look for it. And like Michael said, that nutrition label where we're used to seeing how many calories in it, we have to get used to seeing, like, wait, is this a donut or an apple that I'm buying? Like, we don't know what is good or bad. So I think there's just a journey that we all need to go on as consumers. But then as a big company like Dow in procurement, right, where I sit, it's also, I want to see that, right? I'm demanding that. Like, I want to see what am I buying here? And that, so we can ask it in big and small ways, and it all has an impact, I think.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne, and especially for that last point about the way in which it's not just individual retail consumers who can be impacted by this, but large institutional consumers and making large procurement decisions, from large multinational corporations to large national governments to subnational governments. This information can play out in any number of ways. So another question I'd like to put out to the panel is about the issue of double counting. One of the issues that often comes up in conversations around carbon accounting is this concern expressed by some about the so-called problem of double counting. And it's a problem from the regulated community, and it's often a problem that's frequently expressed by regulators in thinking about disclosure as well as installing particular requirements. What exactly is double counting? Why is it a concern? And how should, if at all, the sort of harmonized approaches that are being advocated for here address the problem? Again, feel free to jump on in. No need to raise hands.
Shall I take this, or I can kick this off at least? Yeah, double counting, always a big topic and concern around carbon accounting. We don't want to see the numbers twice, but actually inherently there is double counting, right? There has to be double counting, or there should be, between scope 1 and 3. And Samuel laid it out really clearly, right? Shell in their scope 3 is the use of sold products. That's the liters of gas or diesel that they're selling, and then I am burning in my car. Okay, I don't have a car, but if I did, you know, that's double counting. Like I am burning it, they're selling it, they're producing it, right? It should be double counted, and we don't need to worry about that, right? Like Dow has a scope 1 and a scope 3 that then goes to our consumers, right? That is going to be in their scope 3. And there's just kind of, it should be double counted between the supplier and the consumer. But then there's another angle to double counting, right? And that's when you think about carbon offsets. Perrine was talking about carbon offsets. That's a certificate that should only be used once, right? That shouldn't be double counted. And that's going to start getting very interesting, right? When you think about net zero pledges and these complicated supply chains that we have, right? Where I might be buying carbon offsets to make my goods net zero and passing that along. Can my consumer take credit for that? Is that double counting? And I think that's starting to, you know, it overwhelms me to even think about how are we going to account for you know, all these carbon offsets. And I've been advocating for a new approach, which is, I didn't make this up, but carbon insetting, right? Supply chain carbon insets, where companies are using carbon offsets within the supply chain, and we come up with our common language of how we're accounting for that along the supply chain between supplier and consumer. So we're not doing the dreaded double counting, right? Or maybe we double count where it's appropriate. So I think there's a lot that needs to be sorted out in that world of carbon offsets. Yeah, that I think say we're at the beginning of the journey there.
I would just echo what Suzanne said, that I think it's a red herring double counting. I think it's a market, you know, these emissions are a market risk and they need to be reduced. So yes, there will be double counting and it's not a problem.
Great, thank you, Barbara. Samuel, there are a couple of questions that have come up in the Q&A about litigation and I'd like to sort of have your thoughts on one of them. You know, a lot of the carbon accounting issues, they come up against some sort of baseline or some sort of target, obviously, whether it be a net zero target or another target such as the Paris Agreement. The case that you were involved in obviously invokes the Paris Agreement as a key element of the case. Would you say that European courts take the Paris Agreement more seriously than those in other jurisdictions, including the US? And I'm guessing you took a look at this in arguing and preparing your case. And if so, what do you, why might that be?
First of all, I certainly hope not that is the case. So let me start off with that. But yeah, honestly, for that to be answered in a good manner, I would have to be studying all of these cases. So that's pretty hard. But maybe that's the thing that we learned about our own cases, and that's might be something that is just now really getting traction, is what I really explained in my presentation, is that it's not a legal question, but it's a factual starting point that we all, as the whole world, just stated against each other that we just defined a universal danger line and we cannot cross that. And from that starting point, you can ask all the legal questions you want, and you have to look at all the national legal systems. What does that factual starting point mean in my national jurisdiction? And that is what we did in the Shell case. As I said, obviously, RDS is not a party to the Paris Agreement, but we do have in our national system a duty of care, which means you have to act socially responsible, very short notice. So then that you can use that fact to color in the open norm of a duty of care. So yeah, this is really the core idea behind the climate litigation practice.
Great, thank you, Samuel. And I just to chime in quickly, I mean, I would say that we are indeed at the beginning of this, and what we have seen so far is that European courts have been receptive to the Paris Agreement, but they're not alone in terms of global jurisdictions. The United States courts have not yet been quite as assertive in accepting the Paris Agreement as a legally binding target, or as something that even ought to guide or necessarily guides national or subnational action. It has come up, it has been recognized, but other courts seem to be taking it in a bit of a different way. So there's, I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. I'll take one from the chat here, and then Barbara, I noted that you have a interesting question as well. So let's start with this question from the participant list. What's the link between carbon accounting and the circular economy? And do we have good key performance indicators which we can use as we push the circular economy concept, in addition to the energy intensity indicator? So I'm wondering if anyone here might be able to draw some of these connections between circular economy vocabularies, circular economy concepts, and the work of carbon accounting. Suzanne, I don't know if this is something that comes up in your work now and or in the past, I would think.
Yeah, that's a great question. I love that question. And I think it's interesting how far CO2 has evolved as a meaningful KPI, right? That we can kind of count on and set goals around. And circular economy is emerging, right? It's a kind of a newer concern that companies are facing. And I think there is a bit of a struggle for what is a good KPI for circularity. And I think we can think about it in terms of what I'm buying, right? Buying post-consumer recycled content and things like that, you know, what is coming in, but what happens to a product after it leaves my hand, right? The end of life, is it getting incinerated, recycled, landfilled? That's harder to track, right? So I think there's that mismatch again. It's the same with carbon accounting, right? It's kind of easier to look at upstream than it is at downstream after it leaves your hands and you don't have control over it anymore. So I think we can learn from CO2 and apply it to the circular economy. But yeah, I think more work to be done there. It's a great topic for research.
Great, thank you, Suzanne. So with our final question, Barbara, I'm not quite sure how you want to articulate this, but I'll turn it over to you.
Well, okay, so I think there was an email that went out today about scope 4 emissions. There's a new definition, and scope 4 is, and I was wondering if the panelists had heard about it and if anyone had a view. I think my understanding is that they are the emissions that one will, if you're lobbying to stop reducing emissions, these are scope 4 emissions basically. So it's another form of emitting, I guess, indirectly, but I don't know that much about it. I don't know if anyone else has heard about it. It sounds like it's very recent. So I was curious as to whether anyone else had heard about it and wanted to share their views. But yeah, I heard it's something, if you're stopping reducing emissions by continuing to lobby against emission reductions, this would be an example of scope 4 emissions.
I have heard of that. It's a new thing, as you said, Barbara. I've heard of that in terms of like product benefits. So like if you're making something that has emissions, but also helps to reduce emissions. So you're enabling some sort of emissions reduction. So that's a different angle from what you said, but I'm sure they're probably, you know, related thing. So maybe more accounting methodologies forthcoming. But one to be careful with in terms of greenwashing, right?
And of course,
Yeah.
later this week here in the U.S., there will be a hearing up on the Hill where there will be a congressional inquiry into the activities of fossil fuel companies around climate change, which very much gets in part, I expect will very much get in part at that issue of lobbying activities around lobbying and the role that also plays in contributing to continuing increases in greenhouse gas emissions. So we are at the end of our panel. I'd like to thank each of you, Suzanne, Barbara, Samuel, and Martin, for your contributions today. We've covered obviously a lot of territory from the technical to the high level, and your thoughts and insights have been very much appreciated. I'd like to thank the participants for logging in their questions. There are some that are still in there that we did not get a chance to get to, and I apologize for that. But we always are running on limited amount of time. So Brooke, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Mike.